Jack Mitchell had worked tirelessly for years to become the CEO of Horizon National Bank. Starting as a part-time teller in college, Jack had climbed the ranks, learning every facet of the banking industry. His rise wasn't due to family connections or privilege. It was the result of endless hours of work, navigating the ups and downs of the business. Now, as CEO, Jack had a deep understanding of the industry from both the front lines and the executive suite. He knew the importance of staying connected with his employees and customers, understanding their experiences, and being fully aware of the environment in which his company operated. Lately, however, Jack had been hearing troubling reports from both employees and customers. Complaints had been surfacing about a growing dissatisfaction among the bank's staff. The feedback indicated a shift in the company culture. Employees were unhappy, morale was low, and there were numerous reports of poor customer service. Jack had always prided himself on building a company rooted in respect, integrity, and customer satisfaction. The stories he was hearing didn't sit well with him. Jack couldn't help but feel that there was more going on beneath the surface than what was being reported. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Jack decided to go undercover. He didn't want to rely on second-hand information. He wanted to see firsthand what was really happening inside his branches. Disguising himself as a regular customer, Jack dressed in a simple, unassuming navy blue polo, jeans, and sneakers. He left his usual polished attire and his signature Rolex at home. The man who walked through the doors of Horizon National Bank's branch in Columbus, Ohio, wasn't a CEO. He was just another customer. No one knew who he was, and that was exactly the point. Jack wanted to experience the bank's service from a customer's perspective. What he was about to see would challenge everything he had built and might reveal the truths his employees had been hiding. Jack Mitchell walked into the Horizon National Bank branch with a feeling of quiet anticipation. As he entered, the sound of soft chatter and the gentle hum of the air conditioning greeted him. The bank was calm, with a handful of customers scattered throughout the lobby. At first glance, everything appeared normal. The employees were busy at their stations, helping customers, processing transactions, and answering questions. It was a typical day in the bank, or so it seemed. But Jack's keen eye noticed something off. There was an underlying tension that seemed to ripple just beneath the surface. While the employees were efficient, there was something about the way they interacted with customers that felt mechanical, lacking warmth. The vibe in the room was stiff, as though everyone was going through the motions but not truly engaged. Jack stepped forward, taking in the environment as a regular customer would. He didn't expect to be treated like royalty, but he did expect basic courtesy. He walked up to the receptionist's desk, offering a polite smile and waiting for an acknowledgement. The receptionist, a woman in her early 30s with a perfectly maintained appearance, was focused intently on her computer screen. She didn't look up at Jack, didn't greet him, nor did she offer any kind of assistance. It was as though he didn't exist in her line of sight. A few moments passed, and Jack stood there, observing the scene around him. Then, a well-dressed man walked through the door, his tailored suit and shiny leather shoes gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Immediately, the receptionist's demeanor shifted. She stood up straight, greeted the man with a smile, and warmly offered her assistance. She was suddenly attentive, even asking if he would like a drink. Jack's smile faded slightly. It was impossible not to notice the stark contrast in treatment. Jack moved to the next area, where the tellers were processing transactions. He stood in line, waiting his turn, but again he was ignored. No one even looked his way. He watched as a couple, dressed in business attire, approached the teller ahead of him. The teller greeted them with a warm smile, asking how she could assist them. She made sure to address each of their needs, offering friendly conversation and even providing extra information about their account. Jack, however, felt invisible. When it was his turn, the teller, a young woman in her mid-20s, barely acknowledged his presence. She didn't smile or offer a greeting. Instead, her voice was flat, bordering on dismissive, as she simply asked, "What do you need?" Jack felt a flash of irritation, but kept his calm, choosing to proceed with the interaction. He asked about opening a high-value account, expecting to receive some assistance. The teller's response was cold and unhelpful. She barely looked at him while she rattled off a list of requirements. clearly uninterested in explaining the details. As Jack stood there watching the disparity unfold, it became painfully clear. The customers who looked the part were treated with respect, attention, and courtesy. Those who didn't fit the mold, like him in his simple polo and jeans, were dismissed and made to feel like they didn't belong. This was no mistake. This was a pattern. Jack's suspicions were growing. The bank, which he had worked so hard to build on values of equality and fairness, was clearly struggling with its internal culture. There was an unspoken hierarchy, and it wasn't just about money. It was about appearances. The bias and disrespect that Jack had witnessed firsthand were inexcusable. It wasn't just poor customer service, it was a systemic issue within the organization that needed to be addressed. As he observed, Jack made a mental note. Something needed to change, and fast. As Jack stood in the bank's lobby, waiting for his turn at the counter, something unexpected caught his attention. It was faint at first, almost inaudible, but there was no mistaking the sound of someone crying. The muffled sobs drifted from the break room, drawing Jack's focus away from the ongoing transactions. At first, he dismissed it, thinking it might just be a brief moment of frustration or a personal issue that would resolve quickly, but the sound lingered and his curiosity grew. It wasn't common to hear such distress in a workplace, and certainly not in one he had built on the values of professionalism and support. He subtly moved closer to the break room, careful not to draw attention to himself, and as he peered inside, he saw a young teller, Emily, hunched over in a chair, her hands tightly gripping the edges of the table. Her face was hidden, but the subtle tremor of her shoulders revealed her emotional state. The second employee, a young man named Jake, was standing beside her. He appeared to be trying to console her, speaking in hushed tones. Jack couldn't hear the exact words, but the weight of the conversation was clear. Emily's body language spoke volumes. Her posture was defeated, her gaze fixed downward, as though she were trying to avoid facing the reality of whatever had triggered her distress. Jack stood there for a moment, frozen, his heart sinking as he watched the interaction. He wanted to step in, to help, but in that moment he realized he wasn't there as the CEO of Horizon National Bank. He was simply a customer, a stranger to these employees. For now, he needed to observe. From the little he could hear, Emily whispered something to Jake that made Jack's stomach churn. "I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice barely audible. "I'm stuck. If I speak up, I'll lose my job. If I stay silent, I'm just letting it happen." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of unspoken fear. Jake, his expression sympathetic, tried to comfort her, but the defeat in Emily's voice was palpable. Jack's heart ached as he realized that the source of Emily's distress wasn't a particularly difficult customer or a one-off bad experience. This was something much deeper. She wasn't just frustrated. She was feeling trapped, suffocated by the very system that was supposed to support her. The source of her pain wasn't just the job, but the environment in which she was working, where control, fear, and power dynamics shaped every interaction. Jack's mind raced. He had worked in the banking industry for years, starting from the ground up, and he knew all too well the pressures of the job, but he had never imagined a culture like this. He had built Horizon National Bank to be a place of growth, trust, and fairness. Yet, here in this small branch, he saw an entirely different reality. Emily wasn't dealing with an over-demanding customer or an unmanageable workload. She was battling an abusive culture created by a toxic and controlling management style. The manager, who Jack had noticed earlier keeping a close eye on the staff, had not just been overseeing operations, he had been instilling fear. Emily wasn't the only one suffering, but she was the one brave enough to show her pain. This was no longer just a matter of poor service or unhappy employees. It was about systemic abuse within the organization, and it was all happening under Jack's nose. The realization hit Jack like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about a difficult workday or a personal issue. This was a problem that ran deep within the bank's culture, where employees were too afraid to speak up, where managers wielded power without regard for the well-being of their team. Jack's worst fears were coming true. The bank he had built, the institution he had poured his heart and soul into, had a serious toxic undercurrent that had been growing unchecked for far too long. But now, he couldn't ignore it any longer. The cry he had heard wasn't just the sound of one employee's distress. It was the echo of a broken system. Jack turned away from the break room, his mind racing with the knowledge that he couldn't let this continue. He had to act, but he also knew that simply firing someone or issuing a warning wouldn't solve the deeper issue. The problem wasn't just Emily or her manager. It was the whole culture within the bank, and that culture had to change. Jack had built this bank to stand for something, but it was clear now that something had gone terribly wrong. As he walked back toward the counter to finish his customer experience, he made a silent vow. Things were about to change, and they would change now. As Jack observed the interactions within the bank, his attention turned back to Emily, the young teller who had been visibly upset earlier. He watched her as she stood at her station, attempting to help a customer, but it was clear that her usual demeanor had changed. There was a tension in her posture, a hesitance in her movements. Her eyes frequently flicked toward the back office, where Mr. Stevens, the manager, sat watching the floor with an intense gaze. The discomfort was palpable. Emily's every action seemed to be influenced by Mr. Stevens's presence, as if she were walking on eggshells, constantly waiting for him to notice any misstep. The way Mr. Stevens interacted with Emily and the lack of support she received from him stood in stark contrast to how other employees like the young male teller Jack had seen earlier behaved. The male teller worked with confidence, moving freely around the bank, laughing with customers and engaging in conversation with his colleagues. He was even joking with a regular customer, offering a warm, friendly service with no visible fear of being reprimanded. But Emily, every time she glanced at the back office, it was as if she was seeking approval, dreading the manager's disapproving gaze. Jack knew that this behavior wasn't just a minor issue. It was a glaring example of the power dynamics that were at play within the bank. Jack's concern grew as he watched the scene unfold. The imbalance was stark. While the male teller moved about with ease, engaging freely with customers, Emily's every action seemed to be scrutinized. There was no balance, no equal treatment. The employees who seemed to be more confident and assertive, like the young male teller, were given the freedom to work without fear. But Emily, who Jack had already seen was a hard worker, constantly looked over her shoulder trying to please her manager. The situation was not just one of poor management. It was about a fundamental abuse of power that created a toxic environment where employees were either too afraid to act or too wary to challenge the status quo. It wasn't just Emily who was affected. Jack could feel the unease of the entire branch, as though the air was thick with fear. The bank's employees, particularly the tellers, were walking on tenterhooks, afraid of making mistakes, afraid of drawing the wrong kind of attention. Jack had seen this before in other workplaces, where managers ruled with fear rather than support. But seeing it firsthand in his own company, where he had always strived to create a culture of mutual respect, felt like a slap in the face. The tension in the room wasn't just coming from Emily. It was a palpable feeling that hung over the entire branch, infecting every interaction. As Jack walked across the floor, he caught snippets of whispered conversations between employees. They spoke in hushed tones, careful not to let their words travel too far. One of the young male tellers muttered to a colleague, "Don't make him notice you, just keep your head down and do your job." It was clear that there was an unwritten rule in this branch. Stay quiet, stay compliant, and hope that Mr. Stevens wouldn't find fault with your work. Jack's heart sank. This wasn't just about one bad manager. This was the culture he had built, one that allowed power to be abused, where employees were afraid to speak up, afraid to be themselves. It was a culture where fear trumped respect. The more Jack watched, the more it became clear that the issue wasn't just with Mr. Stevens. Yes, he was the one who held the power, but the issue ran deeper. It was the culture he had fostered, one that made employees like Emily feel like they didn't matter. It wasn't just about poor service or management flaws. It was about the systemic fear that permeated the bank, a culture that had spread from the top down. Mr. Stevens's behavior was an outward manifestation of that culture. He wasn't just controlling Emily, he was controlling everyone. And the employees who had the confidence to act, to speak up, were the exceptions, not the rule. Jack stood in the middle of the branch, taking it all in. He was watching a toxic culture play out right before his eyes, one that he had never imagined could be happening under his own roof. But now that he was seeing it firsthand, it was undeniable. Employees who were scared to speak up, afraid to do their jobs without fear of being reprimanded, had become the norm. The power dynamics within the branch had created a toxic work environment, where only those who conformed to Mr. Stevens's control were allowed to thrive. Jack's concern turned into anger, not just at Mr. Stevens, but at himself for allowing this to happen. This was a culture he had to change, and he had to do it now. As Jack stood there, observing the tense interactions and the fear that had settled over the branch, he knew he couldn't leave without understanding the full extent of the issue. He had seen the signs of a toxic culture, employees like Emily afraid to speak up, and a manager like Mr. Stevens who seemed to enjoy wielding power over his team. But Jack also knew that to address this issue properly, he needed more insight. He couldn't rely solely on what he had witnessed from his own brief observations. He needed to gather more information from the employees themselves to fully grasp the situation. Jack's eyes scanned the branch and landed on Tom, a mid-level employee who had been working the counter. Jack had noticed that Tom seemed to carry a sense of unease, much like the others. He wasn't as comfortable as some of the more confident employees, and Jack sensed that Tom might have valuable information. He approached him casually, asking if Tom had a moment to talk. Tom hesitated at first, his eyes flicking nervously to the back office where Mr. Stevens had been. But there was something in Jack's voice, something unspoken that seemed to offer reassurance, and Tom finally nodded. Sitting down in a quiet corner of the branch, Jack and Tom began talking, with Jack keeping the conversation light at first. He asked about the daily work environment and how things had been going at the branch. Tom was reluctant to speak at first, but the more Jack encouraged him, the more Tom opened up. Finally, Tom admitted what Jack had feared all along. Emily wasn't the only one who had been mistreated. "It's not just her," Tom confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's the way he treats all of us. He controls everything. Late shifts, impossible demands, and if you don't fall in line, you're out. Emily's just been getting the worst of it. She's too afraid to speak up." The truth hit Jack like a hammer. All the subtle signs of a toxic workplace culture he had seen earlier were confirmed. Mr. Stevens wasn't just an ineffective manager. He was creating an environment where employees were terrified to do their jobs, afraid of punishment and retribution. Emily, along with others like Tom, had been pushed to the breaking point. They were stuck in a system that preyed on their vulnerabilities, using fear as a tool to keep them compliant. Jack's frustration deepened. He realized that this wasn't a matter of one employee's issues. It was a systemic problem that ran through the entire branch, stemming directly from Mr. Stevens's leadership. Tom's confession confirmed everything Jack had suspected. The abuse wasn't just happening to Emily, it was happening to everyone around her. Jack could see it now. The way Tom had spoken with such hesitation, the way his voice had cracked when describing the situation. This wasn't just a bad boss or an isolated incident. It was a toxic culture that had spread throughout the entire branch. Employees had been so conditioned to fear Mr. Stevens that they couldn't even talk about their own struggles without feeling like they'd be punished. Jack's heart sank. How had things gotten this bad? But as much as he was angry, he also knew that he couldn't ignore what he had just learned. He had to act, and he had to act now. After hearing Tom's confession, Jack made a decision. He couldn't walk away from this, not when he now had the full picture. He couldn't let this toxic culture continue, not when it was so deeply ingrained. Jack knew he had a responsibility to not only the bank's employees, but to the customers who trusted the bank to operate with integrity. It wasn't just about fixing one problem, it was about fixing the entire culture that had allowed Mr. Stevens to thrive in an environment of fear. Jack stood up, his mind made up. He was going to intervene directly, It was time for a change. A complete overhaul of the way things had been done, starting with Mr. Stevens. Jack's resolve solidified as he walked back through the branch, his thoughts swirling with the knowledge that he had to act fast. The longer he waited, the more employees like Emily would suffer, and the more entrenched this toxic environment would become. He knew that if he didn't do something immediately, the bank's reputation and its future were at stake. Jack's footsteps were steady as he approached the back office. He was about to confront the issue head-on, and he wasn't backing down. This was the moment for change, and Jack was ready to make it happen. Jack could feel the weight of the moment as he stood outside Mr. Stevens's office. His breath steadied, and his mind ran through the details of what he was about to do. The evidence he had gathered was clear. The toxic culture Mr. Stevens had cultivated was no longer something Jack could ignore. He couldn't let this go on any longer, not after hearing from Tom, not after seeing the distress on Emily's face. This wasn't just a workplace issue. It was a matter of respect, fairness, and the well-being of his employees. Jack knew it was time to confront Mr. Stevens directly. Stepping into the office, Jack found Mr. Stevens sitting at his desk as if nothing were amiss. He was reviewing paperwork, his gaze focused on the numbers in front of him. But the moment Jack entered, the atmosphere shifted. Mr. Stevens looked up, his expression hardening. The quiet tension between them was palpable, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Jack didn't waste time with pleasantries. He walked straight to the point. "Mr. Stevens, I know what's been happening here," Jack said, his voice steady but firm. "I know how you've been treating Emily and the other employees. This toxic environment stops now." Mr. Stevens's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a tight smile. "I'm not sure what you're talking about," he said, trying to brush off Jack's accusation. "There's nothing wrong with the way things are being run here. We're just doing things the way they've always been done." Jack shook his head, his frustration building. He had seen enough, heard enough. "No, Mr. Stevens, you've created an environment of fear. You've made your employees feel trapped, and that stops today." Jack reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, tapping it a few times. "I've got recordings. I've got first-hand accounts. The truth is out there, and now it's time you face it." The color drained from Mr. Stevens's face as he registered what Jack was saying. He opened his mouth to respond, but Jack didn't give him the chance. "I'm not just going to sit by and let you continue this. You've been mistreating your staff and you've been abusing your position of power. I can't allow this to happen in a company I built." Jack paused, letting his words sink in. He knew Mr. Stevens was trying to come up with an excuse, but this time there was no room for excuses. "I've seen the fear in their eyes. I've seen the way they're walking on eggshells around you. This is no longer just a problem for one employee. This is a problem for the entire branch. And it ends now." The moment Jack finished speaking, he could see the realization hitting Mr. Stevens. His carefully constructed facade of control was crumbling. It was clear now that Mr. Stevens understood that Jack wasn't just another manager or outsider. Jack was the CEO, the very person who could make or break him in an instant. The shift in power was palpable, and Jack could see it in Mr. Stevens's eyes. The fear, the panic. Jack let the silence stretch for a few seconds, watching Mr. Stevens's reaction. He knew this wasn't easy for the man, but it was necessary. Jack wasn't here to play games. He was here to ensure that his bank operated with integrity. Then, with calm authority, Jack revealed the truth. "You've been mistreating me this entire time, Mr. Stevens," Jack said, his tone unwavering. "I'm not just any customer. I'm the CEO of Horizon National Bank." The words hung in the air like a bombshell, and the shock on Mr. Stevens's face confirmed that Jack's revelation had struck hard. Jack saw the color drain from his face, the realization sinking in that he had just insulted and dismissed the very person who owned the company. "You didn't even recognize me, did you?" Jack continued, his voice calm but firm. "You treated me like I didn't belong here, like I wasn't worth your time, and that's exactly what you've been doing to your staff." The room was still for a moment, and Jack let the impact of his words settle. Mr. Stevens stammered, trying to find a response, but nothing came out. Jack didn't wait for him to recover. "You're fired, Mr. Stevens," Jack said, his decision final. "And I expect the rest of your team to be held accountable as well. There will be immediate changes to the way this branch operates." Jack's voice grew firmer as he continued, "We will not tolerate a workplace where people are made to feel inferior. From now on, every employee here will be treated with the respect they deserve. No more fear. No more power plays." Jack took a deep breath, ensuring that his words were clear and unequivocal. "This is the kind of bank I want to lead," he said, looking directly at Mr. Stevens. "A bank that treats everyone equally, regardless of their position, their background, or their appearance. We build our success on respect, on trust, and that's what we're going to do moving forward. I will ensure that no one, customer or employee, ever feels less than." He turned to walk out, but before he left, he looked back at Mr. Stevens. "Consider this your last lesson in how to treat people." After the confrontation with Mr. Stevens, Jack knew that the real work was just beginning. The changes he needed to make at Horizon National Bank weren't going to happen overnight, and the first step was implementing a new set of training programs. These weren't just going to be quick, surface-level seminars. Jack insisted that the training focus on respect, leadership, and communication, values that had been sorely lacking under the previous management. He wanted every employee to understand that the culture of fear, bias, and power struggles had no place in the bank anymore. These sessions were not going to be optional. They would be mandatory for all employees, starting with the entire branch staff. Jack made it clear that everyone, from tellers to management, needed to be on the same page about the future of the bank and the direction they were headed. The first few days after Jack's intervention were tense, as the employees adjusted to the new atmosphere. But Jack was determined not to let fear or uncertainty take over. He made sure the staff knew that this wasn't just about punishing bad behavior, it was about creating a work environment where everyone could thrive. He established policies that encouraged transparency and open communication between the staff and management. No more secret meetings or whispered complaints behind closed doors. From now on, if someone had a concern, they would be heard. Jack even set up an anonymous feedback system so employees who were still nervous about speaking up could do so without fear of retaliation. The shift wasn't immediate, but the employees began to realize that the support they needed was now in place. For the first time in a long while, they felt like they had a voice in shaping their work environment. As the weeks passed, Jack saw slow but steady improvements in the atmosphere at the branch. The tension that had once hung thick in the air was beginning to lift. Employees like Emily, who had been visibly shaken by the toxic culture, started to feel empowered. She no longer looked over her shoulder in fear when her manager walked by. She smiled more, interacted with customers more confidently, and even started offering suggestions during team meetings. It wasn't just Emily. The entire branch began to transform. Staff members who had once been distant, disconnected, or fearful of their superiors now began to approach Jack with ideas, concerns, and feedback. The openness that Jack had fostered was starting to take root, and he could see that the culture shift was working. While these changes were encouraging, Jack knew they were just the beginning. He wasn't content to stop with one branch. The lessons he had learned here, the changes they had made together, had to be applied across every branch of Horizon National Bank. Jack was committed to making sure that the culture of respect, equality, and transparency became the foundation of every branch, not just the exception. He began planning for company-wide training sessions, ensuring that the new policies would be implemented and understood at every location. The goal was simple: to create an environment where every employee, no matter their role, felt valued and respected. This wasn't just a temporary fix. It was a permanent change to the bank's culture. The transformation of the branch wasn't perfect, and there were moments of resistance, especially from some older employees who had grown used to the old way of doing things. But Jack didn't let that stop him. He continued to meet with the team regularly, addressing concerns and reinforcing the importance of their shared values. Over time, the resistance faded, and employees began to realize the benefits of the new approach. Customers also began to notice the change. They felt more welcome, more heard, and more respected. The bank's reputation for customer service improved, and the complaints that had once plagued the branch started to fade. Jack knew that a good work environment didn't just benefit the employees, it also translated into better service for their clients. It was a win-win situation, and it reinforced Jack's belief that a healthy work culture was the key to success. By the end of the quarter, the branch had made remarkable strides. Employee morale was at an all-time high, and the performance metrics had started to improve as well. The lessons learned here were now spreading to other branches. Jack personally visited each branch to ensure that the same policies were being put into practice. He was determined not to let the progress made at this location be an isolated success, but a model for the entire company. Jack's commitment to transparency and respect wasn't just about changing a branch, it was about changing the entire culture of Horizon National Bank. He knew that if they could replicate this success across all locations, they would build a stronger, more successful company. As Jack reflected on the progress made, he felt a sense of pride. The branch, once fraught with tension and fear, was now a place where employees could bring their best selves to work every day. The changes had taken time, effort, and commitment, but they were worth it. Jack was confident that Horizon National Bank was on the right path, not just to financial success, but to being a company that valued its people above all else. He had learned a valuable lesson during his undercover visit. No matter how high you climb, you must always stay connected to the people and the culture that built your company. And for Jack, that was the foundation of true leadership. If this story resonated with you, we want to hear from you. Drop your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. How have you dealt with toxic workplace cultures or worked to create positive change? Your story could inspire others. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join the Deep Inside HQ community, where we bring you more real stories that expose the truth and encourage real change in businesses everywhere. Stay tuned for more powerful stories that challenge the status quo.